In 8845, something almost invisible appeared in the fields of Ireland. A brown spot on a green leaf, no bigger than a fingernail. Within months, that spot would kill 1 million people and drive another million across the Atlantic in coffin ships. But the thing that made the catastrophe possible was not the blight. It was the potato itself, the very crop that had saved Europe from famine 2 centuries earlier now became the instrument of its greatest disaster. Today you can buy a 5-pound bag of potatoes for $1 at any supermarket. Back then, a single potato was the difference between life and death for an entire family. How did this strange, ugly tuber climb from the high Andes to become the backbone of Europe? How did it lift millions out of hunger only to turn around and nearly destroy an entire nation? That gap from savior to destroyer is the story we're going to unravel. The story does not begin in Europe at all. It begins nearly 8,000 years ago, on the cold, windswept slopes of the Andes in what is now Peru and Bolivia. The potato ancestors grew wild among rocks and drought-resistant shrubs, a small, bitter, poisonous lump. Indigenous farmers, the ancestors of the Inca, noted something. If you left the tubers out in the frost overnight and then trampled them dry, the bitterness leached out and the poison disappeared. They learned to select the most productive plants, generation after generation, turning a toxic wild root into a stable food. By the time the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1530s, the Andean people had domesticated over 3,000 varieties of potato, ranging from purple to yellow to deep red, each adapted to a different altitude and climate. The Spanish were looking for gold and silver. They almost ignored the potato. A few tubers were packed onto ships, as ships provision hardy, long-lasting, easy to store. Those ships sailed to Spain, and from there, the potato began its quiet invasion of Europe. But the Europeans did not embrace it. They considered it strange, even dangerous. Some thought it caused leprosy, since its rough skin looked like the marks of the disease. Others believed it was an aphrodisiac, and that made it even more suspicious. The potato was grown in botanical gardens as a curiosity, not a food. For nearly 200 years, the crop that would one day feed a continent was ignored, mocked, and feared. But meanwhile, something else was happening in Europe. Wars, famines, and a growing population meant that the old staples wheat, rye, barley could no longer keep up. The soil was exhausted. Every few years, a bad harvest led to mass starvation. The kings of Prussia and France realized they needed a miracle crop, something that could grow on poor land and produce more calorie per acre than any grain. And in the late 1500s, they turned to the potato. Authorities began distributing potato seeds and planting instructions. Farmers resisted, so the kings tried a trick. They planted potatoes in royal fields and posted armed guards around them, as if the crop were precious. Local villagers, seeing that anything guarded must be valuable, stole the potatoes at night and planted them in their own fields. The trick worked. By the early 1800s, the potato had spread across northern Europe, from Ireland to Russia, feeding armies, peasants, and the working class. In Ireland, the match was perfect. The damp, cool climate suited the potato better than grain. A single acre of potatoes could feed a family of 6 for a year, whereas the same acre in wheat would barely feed 2. By 1800, the Irish population had soared to over 8 million, and the vast majority of them depended almost entirely on the potato for their daily calories. This seemed like a miracle, a cheap, nutritious crop that could end hunger. But that dependence was a trap, and in 1845, the trap snapped shut. Pay attention to this next detail, because the culprit was a water mold called Phytophthora infestans, which translates roughly to plant destroyer. It arrived in Europe on ships from the Americas, hitching a ride on potato tubers imported for breeding experiments. The spores spread through the air, and when they landed on a potato leaf in moist weather, they germinated within hours. The leaf turned black, then gray, then collapsed. The rot traveled down the stem to the tuber underground, turning it into slimy, stinking mess. In a matter of days, entire field the food supply of dozens of families was destroyed. There was no stopping it. Fungicides didn't exist. Crop rotation didn't help once the spores were in the air. The first signs appeared in Ireland in the late summer of 1845. By October, the potato harvest was gone. The next year, 8846, was worse. The entire crop failed. People watched their food rot in the ground. They dug up the stinking tubers anyway, boiled them, tried to eat them, and got violently ill. The British government, which ruled Ireland at the time, debated what to do. Some officials wanted to stop food exports from Ireland to England. Others argued that free trade should continue. The exports continued. Ships loaded with grain, cattle, and butter left Irish ports every day, bound for England, while people in the countryside starved. The government set up public works projects, building roads, digging ditches to give the Irish money to buy food. But the work was brutal, and the pay was too low to buy enough. And all the while, the blight kept returning. I mean, think about that for a second. Ireland was producing enough food to feed its people, but that food was being shipped out of its own people starved, while its own people starved. This is the part most people never learn about. Between 8845 and 8851, Ireland export hundreds of thousands of tons of grain and livestock to Britain. The potato failed, but the land still produced. But that produce was owned by absentee landlords, most of them English, who wanted their rent paid in cash, and cash meant selling food abroad. There was no moral calculus. There was only economics. The human cost is almost unbearable to recount. By 8851, 1 million Irish had died of starvation or the diseases that followed starvation: typhus, cholera, dysentery. Another million had fled the country, crammed into ships that became known as coffin ships, because so many died on the crossing. Some of those who survived landed in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, where they rebuilt their lives in crowded tenements and faced the same prejudices that every wave of immigrant faces. In total, Ireland's population dropped from about 8.5 million to 6.5 million in just 6 years. That is a loss of nearly 25%. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. The potato had made Ireland dependent, and dependency turned into catastrophe. But the same plant that destroyed was simultaneously becoming Haman's and Lays worry, the salvation of another. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, the potato was quietly becoming a staple crop. German, Irish, and Scottish immigrants brought their potato-growing knowledge with them. And in the absence of the blight, at least for a while, the potato thrived. Fields in Maine, New York, and Pennsylvania produced enormous yields. The cheap calorie source fueled the Industrial Revolution in America, just as it had in Europe. Workers in factories, miners in Pennsylvania coal country, laborers building canals and railroads, they all ate potatoes. It was cheap. It was filling. It was reliable. 7 years of blight, 7 years that reshaped the Atlantic world. And then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the blight receded, but it never disappeared. Phytophthora infestans still exist today, lurking in soil and on infected seed potatoes, waiting for the right conditions to strike in. And here's the cruel irony. The potato that destroyed Ireland was the same potato that had saved Europe from famine just a generation earlier. The same biology that made it a miracle crop, its ability to yield high calories on poor soil, its ease of storage also made it a trap. When that single variety failed, everything failed. Now let me show you what happened next, because the potato story didn't end with the Great Famine. It was about to go industrial. In the decades after the Great Famine, two things happened simultaneously. First, plant breeders and scientists began a desperate search for potatoes that could resist blight. Second, the potato itself began a global conquest that would dwarf anything it had already done in Europe. The famine had scarred the Irish psyche, but it didn't stop the potato's spread. If anything, it accelerated it, because now people knew that depending on a single variety was suicide. Diversity became a survival strategy. In 8851, a shipment of potatoes from the United States arrived in Europe carrying a new disease-resistant variety called the rough purple chili. It wasn't perfect, but it survived. From that stock, breeders developed dozens of new varieties. By the 1870s, the potato had become a global crop. It spread across Russian Empire, where it fed the serfs and later the industrial workers. It reached China and India, carried by colonial powers and missionaries. It climbed in the highlands of East Africa. In every new place, it adapted. But the real transformation came with the Industrial Revolution. Potatoes could be grown in large, mechanized fields. The invention of the potato harvester in the 1850s cut labor costs. Railroads and steamships allowed potatoes to be shipped hundreds of miles. And then came processing. In 1853, a Native American chef named George Crumb, working at a resort in Saratoga Springs, New York, sliced a potato so thin that it fried into crisp. That was the birth of the potato chip. It was a novelty at first, but by the early 1900s, companies like Lay's were mass-producing them. The real game-changer arrived in the 1940s, frozen French fries. Clarence Birdseye had already pioneered frozen vegetables, but French fries were tricky, they turned soggy. Then an inventor named J.R. Simplot figured out a way to blanch the fries in hot oil before freezing them, so they stayed crispy when reheated. Simplot's company became the largest potato processor in the world. And in the 1950s, a fast food chain named McDonald's began buying his frozen fries by the truckload. The potato was no longer a simple tuber. It was a raw material for an industrial food system. Today, the United States produces over 20 million tons of potatoes every year. China produces nearly double that. The potato is the world's fourth largest food crop, after maize, wheat, and rice. But here's the thing, most of those potatoes are processed. About 60% of the American potato crop ends up as French fries, chips, or instant mashed potatoes. The humble baked potato is almost a relic. The modern potato is a commodity, grown in vast monocultures, sprayed with fungicides and pesticides to keep the blight at bay. Because the blight never left. Phytophthora is still out there, evolving, adapting. And this is the part where the story pivots again. Because the same forces that made the potato a cheap, reliable food also created new vulnerabilities. The monocultures of the 21st century are just as fragile as the Irish fields of 8845. One new strain of blight, one that resists the fungicides, could trigger a global crisis. Scientists estimate that a potato blight pandemic today could cause 5 billion in losses within a single season. And while the world wouldn't starve like Ireland did, the shock would ripple through the entire food system. The modern potato sits at the center of a strange contradiction. It is the most efficient way to produce calories on a small plot of land, more efficient than wheat, rice, or corn. And yet the way we grow and eat it today has turned that efficiency into a problem. Consider the French fry. The average American eats about 30 pounds of frozens each year, most of them from fast food restaurants. These fries are made from a handful of specific varieties, Russet Burbank, Ranger Russet, Yepidi, genetically identical clones of each other, planted in fields stretching across Idaho, Washington, and Wisconsin. That uniformity is the exact same vulnerability that destroyed Ireland. One disease that breaks the resistance of Russet Burbank and the entire fry industry collapses. The response from agribusiness has been a chemical arms race. Potato farmers spray fungicides up to 15 times per growing season to keep blight at bay. They douse the soil with insecticides to control wireworms and potato beetles. They apply herbicides to suppress weeds. The result is a high-yield, cosmetically perfect potato, but at a cost that is only partially reflected in the grocery price. The real cost shows up in contaminated groundwater, resistant pests, and the slow erosion of soil health. And then there's the human health angle. The potato itself is a nutrient-dense food, rich in vitamin C, potassium, and fiber, especially if you eat the skin. But the industrial potato has been transformed into something else entirely. When sliced thin and fried in oil at high temperatures, it forms acrylamide, a potential carcinogen. When loaded with salt and fat and consumed in massive quantities, it contributes to obesity, heart disease, and diabetes. The potato that once saved Europe from starvation now sits on a menu board as a contributor to the obesity epidemic. And here's another layer. The global potato trade is built on the backs of the same colonial patterns that created the Irish Famine. The biggest potato producers today are China and India, but the companies that control the seed varieties, the processing patents, and the distribution networks are mostly based in the United States and Europe. India's potato crop is huge, but much of it is grown on small plots by subsistence farmers who can barely afford the chemical inputs. They are trapped in the same dependency cycle. The potato is their best chance for a reliable food source, but monoculture makes them vulnerable. and the seeds they use are controlled by corporations hundreds of miles away. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about where we are now. In 2009, a new strain of Phytophthora infestans emerged in Denmark. It was resistant to the most common fungicide used across Europe and North America. Within 2 years, it had spread to Germany, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. Scientists are racing to develop resistant varieties, but it takes years to breed a new potato, and the blight evolves much faster. Meanwhile, the genetic diversity that once protected the potato, the thousands of Andean varieties, each with its own resistance profile, is vanishing. The International Potato Center in Peru has preserved samples of over 4,000 wild and cultivated varieties, but only a handful are used in commercial production. The rest sit in cold storage, a library of resilience that we barely open. This new blight strain, designated EU43, is a warning shot. It tells us something we already knew but prefer to ignore. The industrial potato system is a high-wire act with no net. The same concentration of genetic uniformity that made the Irish Famine possible is now global. The difference is that we can see it coming. We have the science, the data, and the preserved germplasm. Whether we have the will to act is another question. Let me give you a concrete picture. A typical potato field in Idaho is a monoculture one variety planted row after row, stretching to the horizon. The soil is fumigated before planting to kill pests. The plants are sprayed with fungicides every 7 to 10 days during the growing season. Irrigation systems pump water from deep aquifers that are being depleted faster than they can recharge. The Snake River Plain, where most of America's potatoes are grown, has seen groundwater levels drop by hundreds of feet over the past 50 years. The potato you buy at the grocery store contains water that is, in some real sense, non-knowable on human TAM scales. And then there's the energy cost. Potatoes are heavy, about 75% water. Transporting them across the country in refrigerated trucks burns enormous amounts of diesel. Processing them into fries or chips requires even more energy: washing, peeling, slicing, blanching, frying, freezing, packaging. A single French fry has a carbon footprint that includes oil fields, fertilizer plants, truck routes, and freezer warehouses. The humble tuber has become an industrial product, and its cheap price to drive through windows masked a vast, invisible truck of energy and water and chemical inputs. But there is another side to this story, one that offers a glimmer of hope. In parts of the world where industry culture hasn't fully taken hold, the potato remains what it always was: a small-scale, low-input crop that feed a family on a scrap of land. In the Andes, farmers still grow hundreds of varieties, each adapted to a specific microclimate. They store them in traditional ways, freeze-drying them into chuño, a product that can last for years without refrigeration. These methods use no fossil fuels, no synthetic chemicals, no corporate seed licenses. They are not efficient by industrial standards, but they are resilient. They survive centuries of colonialism, war, and climate shifts. They are a living library of adaptation, and they still exist. The question is whether we can learn from them before it's too late, because the pressures on traditional potato farming are immense. Climate change is shifting the growing seasons. Rising temperatures are pushing potato cultivation to high altitudes, the soy altitudes, where the soil is thinner. In Peru, the glaciers that once watered the highland fields are shrinking, and the economic pull of the global market is relentless. Farmers are encouraged to abandon their diverse native varieties in favor of a few commercial ones that can be sold for cash. The potato that once liberated Europe from feudal grain dependency is now being used to trap small farmers in a new kind of dependency. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Because the same forces that created the global potato industry are now being challenged by a grass movement of biodiversity, and local food systems. Seed banks, farmer networks, and chefs are rediscovering the lost varieties: purple potatoes from Peru, fingerlings from the Alps, ancient tubers from the Andes. They are selling them at farmers markets and high-end restaurants, not as a cheap commodity, but as a premium product with a story. It's a small shift, but it signals something important. The potato's value is not just in its calories. It's in its history, its diversity, and its potential to adapt. And yet, Even as this revival gains momentum, the potato story continues to accelerate in a direction that would horrify its Andean ancestors. In laboratories across the world, scientists are editing the potato's genes. They are inserting DNA from other species to confer resistance to blight, to reduce the formation of acrylamide during frying, to improve drought tolerance. The first genetically modified potatoes were approved for sale in the United States in 2005. They are called innit potatoes, bred by the company J.R. Simplot, the same Simplot that revolutionized frozen fries. These potatoes resist bruising and produce less acrylamide. They are engineered, not bred, and they are controversial. Supporters say that genetic modification is the only way to keep up with the evolving blight, to reduce chemical inputs, to feed a growing global population. Critics argue that it deepens corporate control over the food supply, that it puts the remaining heirloom varieties at risk of cross-contamination, tricking, that it treats a symptom rather than the root cause. The root cause, they say, is the monoculture itself. The solution is not a high-tech potato that can survive a spray of glyphosate. The solution is to grow many different potatoes, in many different places, using many different methods. But that answer is not profitable. It does not scale. It does not satisfy the demand for a uniform, year-round supply of blemish-free fries. So the system grinds on. Every year, American farmers plant about 1 million acres of potatoes. Every year, they spray millions of pounds of fungicides. Every year, the blight evolves a little faster. And every year, the global population grows by roughly 80 million people, all of whom need calories. The potato can provide those calories more efficiently than almost any other crop, but only if we can keep it alive. Now, let me take you to a place that holds the future in its hands. In a nondescript building in Lima, Peru, sits the International Potato Center. Inside its vaults are over 7,000 samples of potato seeds, tubers, and tissue cultures, a living collection of the species' genetic heritage. It includes wild relatives from the Andes that have never been domesticated, some of which carry resistances to diseases that don't yet exist. This is the potato's insurance policy. If a super blight wipes out all the russet Burbanks in Idaho, the genetic material to build a new, resistant variety is sitting here in cold storage. The problem is that getting that material from the vault to the field takes years of breeding and regulatory approval. In the meantime, the blight is not waiting. Scientists at the center are now using those wild varieties to breed new Punway cross-pollination, not genetic henin, adfeshioned modification. They have already developed a variety called Canchin that resists late blight without fungicides. It is being grown by small farmers in Peru and Bolivia. It yields well, but it is not as uniform as the commercial varieties, and the chips made from it don't have the same golden color that consumers expect. So it remains a niche crop. The market prefers perfection over resilience. This is the part most people never learn about. The potato is both the most efficient food crop ever domesticated and of the most domesticated, and one of the most vulnerable. Its strength lies in its genetic diversity, the thousands of varieties that can each do something different. Its weakness lies in the fact that we have chosen to ignore that diversity in favor of a handful of clones. We are betting the global food system on the stability of a few genes. And history tells us that a dangerous bet. So here we are, standing in the present moment, holding a potato in our hands. It is a paradox wrapped in a skin. It saved Europe from famine, then destroyed Ireland. It fueled the Industrial Revolution, then became a vehicle for processed junk food. It is a subsistence crop for millions of small farmers and a cash crop for billion-dollar corporations. It is both the most efficient source of calories on Earth and a major contributor to the obesity epidemic. How did we get here? The answer lies in the choices made by kings, scientists, traders, and consumers over 5 centuries, choices that seemed small at the time, but were not. Consider the health angle more closely. A medium baked potato, eaten with the skin, contains about 6 calories, more potassium than a banana, and a good dose of vitamin C and fiber. It is, by any measure, a healthy food. The problem is how we eat it today. The vast majority of potatoes consumed in the United States are processed. French fries, chips, tater, tots, hash browns, instant mashed potatoes. Processing strips away most of the fiber and nutrients, adds oil and salt, and creates compounds like acrylamide that may be harmful. The average American consumes about 50 pounds of potatoes per year, but most of that is in the form of fries. The result is that a naturally healthy food has become a vector for the very diseases it once helped prevent. And then there's the environmental cost. Potatoes require less water per calorie than rice or wheat, but the way they are grown in industrial systems is often unsustainable. The combination of heavy irrigation, chemical inputs, and single variety monoculture grade soil reduces biodiversity and creates chemical runoffs that pollutes waterways. In the United States, the Snake River Aquifer, the primary source of irrigation water for Idaho's potato crop, is being pumped out faster than it can recharge. Some hydrologists estimate it could run dry within decades if current rates continue. That is not a problem for the next generation. That is a problem for this generation. But here's the hardest part. The people who grow the world's potatoes are some of the poorest farmers on the planet. In India, most potatoes are grown on plots smaller than a single American football field. These farmers have no access to the latest fungicides or irrigation technologies. They depend on rainfall and traditional methods. They also depend on a crop that is extremely vulnerable to blight, especially in a warming climate that brings more erratic rains and higher humidity. When the blight hits, they lose their entire year's income. There is no government aid, no crop insurance, no safety net. The potato that feeds their family is also the thing that could ruin them. This is the part most would never learn about. The potato is a class story. The wealthy world eats it as a cheap, processed indulgence. The poor world grows it as a lifeline. The systems that produce cheap fries for the American drive-thru are the same systems that make the crop fragile for the Indian farmer. The profit flows upward, the risk flows downward. That is not an accident. It is the architecture of global agriculture. And now, climate change has rewritten the rules. Rising temperatures are shifting where potatoes can be grown. In the Andes, farmers are planting at higher altitudes than ever before, chasing the cool weather that the potato needs to form tubers. Above a certain altitude, the soil is too thin and steep for product farming. The area suitable for potato cultivation is shrinking. In Europe, heat waves are causing smaller yields and more disease. In Africa, new pests are appearing where they never existed before. The potato has survived climate shifts for thousands of years, but the current pace is unlike anything in its history. And that brings us to the present moment. The potato you can buy at any grocery store today is the product of 8,000 years of human ingenuity, colonial violence, industry efficiency, and biological vulnerability. It carries that entire history inside its skin. When you peel it, you are repeating a gesture that Andean farmers made before the Inca Empire existed. When you fry it, you are participating in a system that was built by immigrants, inventors, and fast food corporations. When you eat it, you are consuming the most efficient calorie-producing plant ever domesticated by humans. But here's the question that lingers. What happens next? The blight is still out there, evolving, adapting. The water is running out into the places where potatoes are grown most intensively. The soil is being depleted. The genetic diversity that protected the potato for millennia is being allowed to wither, preserved only in climate-controlled vaults and on small Andean farms. And the global population keeps growing, demanding more calories, more fries, more chips. The same pressures that created the Irish Famine are now present at a global scale. The only difference is that we can see it coming. I mean, think about that for a second. We have the science, the data, the preserved germplasm. We know exactly what went wrong in 8845, and we know how to prevent it. But the economic and political systems that govern our food supply are not designed for resilience. They are designed for profit and efficiency. And those two priorities are in direct conflict with the biologic reality of a crop that needs diversity to survive. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Every time a farmer chose one high-yielding variety over 100 traditional ones, every time a government promoted monoculture over diversity, every time a consumer demanded a perfect, uniform potato, each of those choices narrowed the genetic base. And when you narrow the genetic base, you create vulnerability. That vulnerability is what killed 1 million people in Ireland. It is what could cause the next great food crisis. And yet, even in this precarious moment, there is something almost miraculous about the potato. It is still here. It is still feeding billions of people. It still has the potential to adapt, if we give it the chance. The wild relatives that grow in the Andes are still there, carrying genes for resistances we haven't even discovered yet. The farmers who never abandoned their diverse varieties are still there, practicing methods that have worked for centuries. The scientists who are trying to breed new potatoes are still there, working against the clock. If you found any part of this story surprising, I want to know which one. Was it the scale of the Irish Famine? The role of colonial politics in making it worse? The fact that the same crop that saved Europe also helped create today's industrial food system? Drop a comment and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. And if this channel is new to you, consider subscribing. We cover a story like this every week, one everyday item, with enough extraordinary histories that you will see the same way again. Because here is the final truth. The potato is not just a food, it is a mirror. It reflects our ingenuity, our greed, our resilience, and our short-sightedness. It shows us that the things we take for granted, the cheap bag of potatoes at the grocery store, the order of fries at the drive-thru, are built on layers of history that we rarely stop to examine. And it reminds us that permanence is an illusion. Every empire falls. Every crop is vulnerable. Every food system can collapse. So the next time you hold a potato in your hand, remember where it came from. The high Andes, where it was first domesticated. The Spanish ships that carried it across the ocean. The European fields that fed millions. The Irish graves that marked its darkest chapter. The factories that turned it into fries. The laboratories that are trying to save it. And the kitchen where you stand right now, holding the finished product of 8,000 years of history. The potato saved Europe. It ruined Ireland. It powered the modern world. And it is sitting in your kitchen right now, waiting for you to decide what happens next.